The lock would not turn. He tried it again, slower this time, the brass key warm from the heat of his glove, and still the mechanism refused him. Somewhere down the long drive, a horse blew through its nose, impatient with the cold. The lamp above the door had been allowed to gutter out. He had a few seconds to decide whether to knock at his own house like a tradesman or to walk around to the servants' entrance like a thief, and neither option suited a man who had spent the night being told he was magnificent. He stood on his own step and listened to the silence inside the great hall, and the silence, polite and complete, listened back. He had not expected to be kept out. He had expected, in fact, the small choreography that always greeted him at this hour. The under-footman who pretended not to recognize the perfume on his coat, the housekeeper who pretended not to have been waiting up, the soft pad of slippered feet across the parquet that meant his wife had gone to bed early and would not ask where he had been. He had counted on these gentle fictions the way other men counted on weather. He pressed his thumb to the bell and heard, very faintly, the chime travel through rooms he had paid to fill and could not at this moment enter. His name, said inside his own head, sounded foolish. Aurelian Vance, 9th Duke of Meerham, locked out of Meerham House at 5 minutes past 6 on a morning that had no business being this cold in May. He thought of the woman whose bed he had left an hour before, the way she had laughed against his shoulder and called him a wicked boy, as though he were not 34 and the master of 3 estates. He had walked out of her drawing room feeling like a king. He stood now on his own marble step, feeling like a parcel that had been refused. The door opened, not wide, just enough to admit a sliver of warmer air and the shape of Mrs. Halloran, the housekeeper, fully dressed at an hour when she ought to have been in her cap. She did not stand aside. She looked at him as if assessing whether he was, in fact, the Duke, or only a very convincing likeness, and then she said, very evenly, that her ladyship had given instructions. He waited for the rest. Mrs. Halloran had been in this house since before his marriage, since before his father's death, since before, in a sense, he had become whoever it was he had become. She had once fished him out of the ornamental pond at the age of 7 and dried his hair on her apron without comment. She did not lower her eyes now. She said her ladyship had given instructions that the locks were to be changed and that his Grace's belongings had been removed from the principal chamber and arranged in the south room, where he was welcome to take his rest if he wished. She said it the way one might announce the menu for luncheon. He noticed that her hands, folded at her waist, were perfectly still. He laughed. It came out wrong, a thin, cracked thing with no warmth in it, and Mrs. Halloran did not laugh with him. He asked, because there seemed to be no other question available, where her ladyship was. In the breakfast room, Mrs. Halloran said, with the post. He stepped inside. He could not, in the end, do otherwise. The hall smelled the way it always smelled at this hour, of beeswax and the cut hyacinths his wife insisted upon in March and April, and the faint ghost of last night's fire. The mirror over the side table caught him without mercy. His cravat was loosened in the manner of a man who had untied it himself in someone else's bedroom and retied it badly in a hackney. There was a small mark on the underside of his jaw, the color of a bruised plum, that he had not noticed when he left her house. He turned his face away from the mirror, as one turns away from an acquaintance one cannot afford to greet. He walked toward the breakfast room with the deliberate ease of a man who is being watched and has not yet decided by whom. He told himself that, whatever this was, it was a domestic squall. He told himself that women of his wife's class did not change locks. He told himself that Eleanor, whatever else she was reasonable. Eleanor was, above all, reasonable. It was the quality on which the whole of their arrangement had rested for 6 years. He had once thought of it with affection, the way one thinks of a well-built bridge. He had lately come to think of it the way one thinks of a long, polite corridor. Useful, lit, almost entirely empty. He paused outside the breakfast room door. Through it, he could hear the small sounds of a morning already underway. The chink of a cup set carefully on a saucer. The whisper of paper turned. A pen scratching, then stopping, then scratching again. He realized, with a small, unworthy surprise, that he could not remember the last time he had heard his wife write a letter. He could not, in fact, remember the last time he had heard her at all when she did not know he was listening. He pushed the door open. She did not look up. Eleanor sat at the round table by the window, a stack of correspondence beside her cup, a thin ledger open at her elbow, and the morning light, which had finally consented to arrive, lay across the back of her hand as she wrote. She was dressed. Not in a wrapper, not in the soft, pale things she favored at this hour, but in a dove-gray gown he did not recognize, fastened to the throat. The kind of gown a woman wears when she intends to be taken seriously by someone who has never previously bothered. Her hair was pinned. Her face, when at last she lifted it, was composed in the way faces are composed by long practice rather than by mood. "Good morning," she said. He had prepared, in the corridor, a great many things to say. He had prepared the wounded laugh, the amused reproof, the affectionate complaint about the cold and the lock and Mrs. Halloran's misunderstanding of orders. He had prepared, behind these, a small dignified anger held in reserve. All of it abandoned him at the door. He stood in the entrance of his own breakfast room with his hat in his hand like a caller, and he said, because nothing else would come, that he understood there had been some confusion about the household keys. "There has been no confusion," she said. She set her pen down. She did it the way she did everything, without flourish, without hurry, as though pens and locks and dukes all responded to the same small civilized signals. She folded her hands on the ledger. She looked at him with an attention he had not received from her in perhaps 2 years, and he understood, with the slow shock of a man stepping into water colder than expected, that she had been preparing for this morning for longer than he had been preparing for anything in his life. "Sit down, Aurelian," she said. He sat. The chair across from her was the chair he always took, and the table, like the chair, was unchanged, and the silver toast rack stood between them as it had stood between them every morning since their wedding breakfast. And yet the room had become a room he had never been in before. He set his hat on the empty chair beside him because there was nowhere else to put it. He was aware of his gloves, still on, and removed them slowly and laid them across the hat. She poured his coffee. She did not ask whether he wanted any. She did it because the gesture belonged to her, and she did not intend to relinquish it merely because the morning was extraordinary. She slid the cup toward him. She did not smile. "I have changed a number of things," she said, "while you were out." He waited. He had learned, very early in their marriage, that Eleanor did not say more than she had intended to say, and that the way to receive information from her was to keep one's own mouth closed. He had used this knowledge, in the past, to be charming. He used it now because he did not trust his voice. "The locks first," she said. "That was practical. I did not want to be uncertain about who came and went last night, or this morning, or hereafter. The household has been informed. The new keys are with Mrs. Halloran and with me. You will have one, of course, when we have spoken. I see no reason to keep you from the house. I have no intention of being theatrical." He found, with some difficulty, his voice. He used it to say that he did not understand. "You will," she said, "in a little while." She turned the ledger toward him. She did not push it across. She only let it angle so that he could read, if he chose, the column of figures down the right-hand side. The handwriting was hers, small and even, and it ran for several pages. He recognized, with the slow, uneasy recognition of a man seeing his own back in a tailor's mirror, the names of his tradesmen, of his clubs, of 2 houses he kept and visited and did not pay for promptly. He recognized, lower down, the name of a jeweler on Bond Street, and beside it a sum, and beside the sum a date. And the date was a date on which he had told his wife he was at his shooting box in the north. He looked up. She was watching him without anger. That was the worst of it. He could have weathered anger. Anger he had handled in other women, in his sisters, in his stewards even, once in a horse. Anger had a shape and a duration. What sat across from him in the dove-gray gown was not anger. It was the cool, finished attention of a person who had at last done her arithmetic and would not be doing it again. "I have engaged an attorney," she said. "Mr. Salter of Lincoln's Inn. You will not have heard of him. He was recommended by my aunt, who, as you know, does not recommend lightly. I have also written to my brother, who is at present in Lisbon, and to my father's old friend at the bank. I have done these things over the past 4 months, not, as you may imagine, in a single fit of feeling last night. Last night merely supplied the occasion for the locks." 4 months, he said. He had not meant to say it aloud. 4 months, she agreed. Since February. Since the morning I was given to understand, by a person who believed she was being kind, that you had taken a house in St. James's Square for a Mrs. Carow, and that the staff there referred to her as the Duchess. I did not blame the person who told me. She had supposed I knew. It was, after all, common enough knowledge that one's florist had heard of it. The florist, Aurelian. I had not, before that morning, fully understood how publicly I had been kept ignorant. He opened his mouth. He closed it. There was, in the room, a stillness that he had often associated with the moment after a shot is fired in a wood, before the birds have decided whether to rise. He had been, all his life, the man who fired. He understood, abruptly and without comfort, that he was, this morning, the wood. Eleanor poured herself more coffee. Her hand did not shake. He noticed, with the absurd particularity of a mind trying to find a footing, that she had taken her wedding ring off and set it beside the saucer, where it caught the morning light and threw a thin disk of gold against the white cloth. She had not made a speech of removing it. She had simply, at some point that he had not witnessed, decided that it was no longer the correct ornament for the occasion, and had laid it down the way she might have laid down a hairpin. "I have not come to a decision about you," she said. "I want you to understand that. I have come to a decision about myself. The two are related, but they are not the same, and I will not let you confuse them, as I think you may try. What I have decided about myself is that I will no longer be a woman who pretends. I have been very good at pretending. I was trained for it from the age of 12. I have been praised for it by women I respect and by women I do not. And I have at last reached the end of my appetite for the practice. That is what I have decided. The rest, the practical rest, follows." She turned a page of the ledger. She did this without looking down, as a person turns the page of a book they have read before. "I have moved your belongings into the south room. That is temporary. I have not yet decided whether it will be permanent, and I will not decide it this morning, and I do not wish you to ask. I have written to your mother. I have not told her anything she will be required to deny in public. I have asked her simply to come and stay. She will arrive on Thursday. I imagine she will want to speak with you. I imagine she will want to speak with me as well. I do not intend to make her choose. She is a good woman, and she has been kinder to me than her son. He felt, distantly, the slow heat of shame climb the back of his neck and settle behind his ears. He had not blushed in 15 years. He had once thought he had outgrown the apparatus. He found that he had not. The girls, Eleanor said, are with their governess. They do not yet know that anything has occurred. I see no reason for them to know it today. I intend, for the present, to behave at meals as I have always behaved. I intend that you should do the same. We will discuss in time what is to be told and when. I would prefer very strongly that they should not learn it from a servant or a cousin. I would prefer that we should not be the kind of parents whose children learn things in that way. I think on this, at least, we may agree. He nodded. He did not trust speech. He thought of his daughters, the elder 6 and grave, the younger 4 and not, asleep upstairs in the nursery wing where he had not been since Christmas. He thought of the elder's face when she had asked him, in February, whether he had been ill, because she had not seen him at breakfast for a long time, and he had said lightly that dukes were like cats and slept where they pleased, and she had not laughed. She had nodded the way her mother nodded and gone back to her bread. There is one more thing, Eleanor said. She closed the ledger. She rested her hand on the cover. She looked, for the first time that morning, faintly tired, and he understood that she had been awake all night, and that she had spent the night not weeping as he had absurdly assumed somewhere in the corridor, but doing this, making lists, writing letters, instructing the housekeeper, deciding by what hour her husband would be permitted to learn what his life had become. I have changed our wills, she said. He stared at her. Not, she added, in any way that disinherits you. I am not vindictive, Aurelian, whatever else I am. I have done what I should have done 6 years ago, and what my father would have insisted upon had he lived to see this marriage settle. I have set aside, in trust, a portion that cannot be touched by you or by any future arrangement of yours for the girls. Not for their dowries, for them. For the women they will become, regardless of whom they marry or whether they marry at all. The trust is in my brother's name and in mine, and after us, in theirs. You are not a trustee. You will not be consulted. I do not say this in anger. I say it because it is now true, and you should know it before luncheon, when my solicitor is expected, rather than after, when you might feel obliged to make a show of having understood. She paused. She looked at her hands. She looked, very briefly, at the ring on the cloth. She did not pick it up. I have also altered the disposition of my own portion, she said more quietly. The portion that came with me. You will recall that there was, in the marriage settlement, some flexibility on that point. I have exercised it. I will not tell you this morning what I have done with it, because I have not yet finished doing it. I will tell you in due course. I do not want you to be surprised in front of strangers. I do not want, in general, for either of us to be surprised in front of strangers ever again. That has been, I think, the true wound of these last years. Not what you did. What you allowed me to learn of it from people who were not me. He set his cup down. He had not drunk from it. The coffee had cooled into a thin, dark mirror in which he could see the underside of his own jaw. and the mark there, and beyond it the chandelier, and beyond that, nothing. Eleanor, he said. It was the first time he had said her name aloud in the room. He heard it as one hears a name called across a crowded square, faintly, with a small delay, attached to a person one is no longer certain one knows. She looked up. She did not soften. She did not, this was the difficult thing, harden either. She simply met him, the way the surface of a lake meets a stone, accepting the disturbance without becoming it. Not yet, she said. You will want to explain, and I will want to listen, and we are neither of us in a condition to do either thing well. Eat something. Go upstairs. Wash. Change your shirt. Sleep, if you can. I have asked Mrs. Halloran to send a tray to the south room. We will speak again at 3. I have kept the afternoon clear. I suggest you do the same. She rose. She did it without ceremony. She picked up the ring from the saucer, considered it for a moment as one considers a small object whose use one has forgotten, and slipped it into the pocket of her gown, not, he thought, because she meant to wear it again, but because she did not intend to leave it lying about for the maids to discuss. She gathered her letters. She gathered her ledger. At the door she stopped and turned, and the morning light, which had crept further into the room while they spoke, lay full upon her now, and he saw, with a small private shock, that she was beautiful, in a way he had stopped noticing some time ago, and that her beauty this morning had nothing whatsoever to do with him. One more thing, she said. I do not wish you to call upon Mrs. Carow today. I do not wish it for my sake. I am beyond minding in any way that would make a scene of it. I wish it for yours. You are not in a state to make decisions in that house this morning, and she is not, I think, in a state to receive them. There will be time, later, for you to arrange whatever you choose to arrange. Today, please, be still. She left. The door did not slam. It did not need to. He sat for a long time in the chair he had sat in for 6 years, and watched the steam rise off the coffee he had not drunk, and listened to the house move around him in its familiar small ways, and understood that the house had not in fact been moving around him. It had been moving around her all this time, and he had mistaken her competence for absence. He thought of the way she had said the florist, Aurelian, with that small, precise tilt of the chin, and he felt, for the first time in many years, ashamed in a way that had nothing to do with being caught. He went upstairs by the back stairs. He did not wish to meet any of his own people in the front hall. The south room had been prepared with the brisk, impartial kindness with which one prepares a guest room for a relative one has not seen in a decade. His brushes were laid out, his razor, a clean shirt, a small posy of the same hyacinths from the hall, in a glass on the writing desk, because Mrs. Halloran did not believe that any room in this house, even a banished one, should be without flowers. He sat on the edge of the strange bed and put his face in his hands, and was very quiet. He thought, against his will, of his father, who had been a less faithful man than himself by every measure that mattered, and of his mother, who had endured it with a kind of polished grief that he had, as a boy, mistaken for serenity. He thought of his own first sight of Eleanor, at 22, across a ballroom in which he had not noticed her until she had laughed at something her uncle said and turned, and the turn had revealed a face that did not require to be looked at, and had therefore drawn his look. He thought of the contract they had signed, and the contract they had unspoken between them. She would be the Duchess he required, and he would be the Duke she could tolerate. And the rest, as people of his class were taught from childhood, was a matter of management. He had managed badly. He understood that now in a way he had not understood it an hour ago. He had managed badly not because he had been unfaithful, which was a sin his world forgave with a shrug, but because he had been careless about the only thing she had ever truly asked of him, which was that he should not let her be the last to know. He had let the florist know. He had let the staff at St. James's Square know. He had let, God help him, the woman at Bond Street know, who had wrapped a necklace for one woman in the paper of a shop where his wife had an account. He had let everyone know but Eleanor, and he had told himself, when he troubled to think of it at all, that this was a kindness. He had not been kind. He had been comfortable. The two had become, in his hands, the same word, and he saw at last that they were not. He rose, he washed, he changed his shirt. He did not sleep. He sat at the writing desk in the south room and looked out at the garden, where a gardener he did not know by name was tying back a climbing rose that had pulled away from its trellis in the night. And he watched the man's hands, patient and unhurried, restore the plant to the wall. And he thought, very simply, that he had a great deal of work to do, and that none of it would be done by 3 o'clock, and that he had better begin anyway. He took up a pen. He drew a sheet of paper toward him. He wrote at the top his wife's name, and then he stopped, because he did not yet know what he intended to say, and because he had at last understood that he was no longer permitted to say things he did not mean. Downstairs in the breakfast room, Eleanor sat alone for a quarter of an hour after he had gone. She did not weep. She had done her weeping in February, in a locked dressing room, with a handkerchief pressed against her mouth, while a maid pretended in the corridor not to hear. She had decided then that she would never weep over this man again, where any living person could overhear her. And she had kept the promise, and she intended to keep it. She finished her coffee. She drew the ledger back toward her. She turned to a page she had not yet shown him, and ran her finger down a column and made a small mark beside an entry and closed the book. She rang for Mrs. Halloran. She asked, in the same level voice she had used all morning, whether the carriage might be brought round at 2, as she had a call to pay in Bedford Square before her solicitor arrived. Mrs. Halloran said it would be brought. Mrs. Halloran did not, as she had not earlier, lower her eyes. There passed between the two women a look that contained no conspiracy and no triumph, only the small mutual acknowledgement of people who had known, for a long time, what the other knew, and had at last been permitted to know it together. In Bedford Square, Eleanor intended to call upon her old governess, who was 81 and almost blind, and had taught her, among other things, that a woman of her station had 2 true freedoms in life: the freedom to keep silent, and the freedom, when silence was no longer honest, to stop. She intended to sit with her for an hour. She intended to drink weak tea and to listen, as she had listened at 12, to the small, wise observations of a woman who had never married and had not been the worse for it. She did not intend to confess. She did not intend to be comforted. She intended only to be, for an hour, in the company of someone who had known her before she had been a duchess, and would, she suspected, still know her after. At 3, in the south drawing room, which was a room they almost never used, and which had therefore been chosen because it carried no memories, they met again. He had eaten a little. He had not slept. He had written and torn up 4 versions of a letter he had finally decided not to write, because letters were a coward's instrument, and he intended, as far as he was able at this late hour, to stop being a coward in small ways. She came in carrying a small leather folder. She had changed her shoes. That was the only alteration. She sat opposite him, in a low chair by the fire, and she set the folder on the table between them, and she did not open it. "I am ready," she said, "to listen, if you are ready to speak. I should warn you that I will not interrupt, and I will not contradict, and I will not at any point in this conversation pretend to a feeling I do not have. I will also not weep. If those terms are acceptable, you may begin." He looked at her. He looked at the folder. He looked at the small fire, which had been lit, he understood, not because the day was cold, but because she had judged, correctly, that they would both need somewhere to put their eyes. "I do not know," he said, "where to begin." "Then begin," she said, "with the part you would most prefer not to say. The rest will be easier." He laughed once, a small, dry sound, the first honest sound he had made in her presence in perhaps 3 years. He set his hands on his knees. He looked, not at her, but at the brass fender, where a flame moved and steadied and moved again. He began, against every instinct he had been raised in, to tell her the truth. Not all of it that day. He was not capable of all of it that day. But enough. Enough to begin. He told her about the house in St. James's Square, and about the necklace, and about the florist, and about the morning in February that he had not known she had endured. He told her that he had believed himself discreet, and that he saw now that he had been only sheltered. He told her that he had taken her steadiness for indifference, and her competence for forgiveness, and that he had been wrong in both, and that he was sorry for the wrongness in a way that he understood to be useless to her, and was, he found, telling her anyway, because he had nowhere else to put it. He did not ask to be forgiven. He understood, somewhere in the middle of speaking, that to ask would be to insult her again. He stopped instead when he had said what he had come to say, and he sat with his hands quiet on his knees, and he waited. She did not speak at once. She let the silence hold. He did not fill it. After a long moment, she opened the folder. Inside were 3 sheets of paper, written in her even hand. She did not pass them to him. She rested her hand on them, the way she had rested her hand on the ledger that morning, and she said, very quietly, that she had not yet decided what kind of marriage they would have from this day forward, and that she would not be hurried into deciding, and that she was telling him this not as a punishment, but as a fact. She said that she did not wish, at present, to live separately. She said that she did not wish, at present, to live as they had lived. She said that the south room was to remain his until she said otherwise, and that he was free to refuse the arrangement, in which case he would be free to leave. But if he stayed, he was to stay on her terms, which she would set out in writing within the week, and which he was free to read, and to disagree with, and to discuss. She said that there would be no more discussion of Mrs. Carow between them, in this house, ever. She said that what he chose to do about Mrs. Carow was his to choose, and that the consequences of the choice would be his to live with, but that she would not be required to hear of it again, and that if he were a man of any remaining grace, he would understand why. He said, after a small pause, that he understood. She nodded. She closed the folder. "There is one more thing," she said, and her voice for the first time that day was not entirely level. She did not look at him as she said it. She looked at the fire. "The girls," she said, "are to know nothing, for the present, except that we are very busy, and that their grandmother is coming, and that the household is being rearranged because it had grown untidy. That is the story for them. It is, I think, also the truth. I will not have them grow up in a house where their parents lie to each other about important things in front of them. I will not have them grow up either in a house where the parents do not speak. I would like, if it is possible, for us to find a way to be in a room with them, together. That is not a performance. I do not know if that is possible. I would like to try." He looked at her then, fully, for the first time since she had said his name at the breakfast room door. She did not look back. She did not need to. He understood that she was offering him something he had not deserved, and would have to work in ways he could not yet imagine to deserve, and that the offering had not been made in tenderness, but in something steadier than tenderness, which was a wish to do well by people smaller than themselves. He understood also that she would withdraw the offering without hesitation if he failed her again, and that this, too, was a kindness, because it told him precisely what was at stake. "I would like to try," he said. "Then we will try," she said. She rose. She gathered her folder. At the door, as in the morning, she paused. She did not turn this time. She said to the door that she would see him at dinner, and that her mother-in-law would arrive on Thursday, and that there was a letter on his desk in the south room from his steward at Miram, which required an answer by the end of the week, and that she had taken the liberty of opening it because the seal had been broken in the post, and that she had not read past the first paragraph because it was not her business to do so. Then she was gone. He sat for some time alone by the fire. He watched the small flames eat their slow, careful way along the underside of a log. He thought of his daughters. He thought of his mother. He thought, with an honesty that surprised him, of the woman in St. James's Square, and of what he owed her, and of what he did not, and of the difficult adult arithmetic of unmaking a thing one had built carelessly. He understood that he would not be the same man at the end of this week that he had been at its beginning. And he understood, further, that this was the first useful thing that had happened to him in a decade. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. They were, in many ways, the least dramatic weeks of his life. His mother arrived on Thursday and stayed 9 days and asked no questions, and was answered by both of them with the careful courtesy of people who had agreed that she should not be required to choose. The household settled into its new shape with the small, uncomplaining grace of a household that had, in fact, been waiting for this shape for years. The locks, once installed, were not mentioned again. The south room acquired, by degrees, a row of books and a particular pair of slippers and a small framed drawing made by the elder daughter of a horse that did not entirely resemble a horse. The principal chamber upstairs remained the Duchess's, and she slept there alone, and the household understood, without being told, that this was not a temporary arrangement to be remarked upon, and they did not remark upon it. Mrs. Carow received a letter, written in his own hand and sealed with his own seal, and what was in it was no one's business but hers and his, and she behaved, on receiving it, with more dignity than he had expected, and rather more than he had earned. The house in St. James's Square was given up by the end of the quarter. The necklace from Bond Street found its way, by a route he did not inquire into, to a hospital for foundling children, where it was sold for a sum that surprised everyone, and the sum endowed 2 beds in the children's ward in perpetuity, and the beds were named, at the matron's discretion, for 2 ordinary saints with no connection to anyone in this story. And that, the Duke thought, when he was told of it months later, was as much closure as a man like him had any right to ask for. His mother, before she left, sat with him one evening in the library and said only that she had loved his father very much, and that loving him had cost her things she did not intend to enumerate, and that she hoped very much that he would be a less expensive husband than his father had been, because his wife was a finer woman than she herself had been, and deserved a less expensive man. She said this without bitterness. She kissed him on the forehead, as she had not done since he was a boy, and went up to bed. He sat for a long time after she had gone, looking at the row of his father's books on the shelf opposite, and understood that he had been given, very quietly, the only piece of advice his mother had ever offered him, and that he had better keep it. As for the Duchess, she did, in time, take her own counsel about the disposition of her portion. The bulk of it went into the trust for her daughters, as she had said. A smaller sum, which surprised her own attorney, was used to buy outright a small house in a country village she had loved as a girl, in her own name and no one else's, and the deed of it lay in a drawer in her writing desk, and she did not speak of it, and she did not visit it, and she did not need to. It was enough that it was hers. It was enough that, if ever again she were required to weep in a locked dressing room, she would know, while weeping, that there existed in the world a small white door with her name on it, and that the door would open to her. They did not, in the end, fall in love again in the way the world likes to imagine such falls. They did something quieter and, in its way, more difficult. They became, by slow degrees, a man and a woman who could be in a room together without performing, who could speak to their children at the same table without making the table a stage, who could ride out on a fine morning side by side and not be required by long unspoken contract to fill the silence with anything they did not mean. He learned to ask her opinion on matters of the estate, and to take it. She learned to give it without first softening it for him. They argued occasionally, in low voices, in the south drawing room, and the arguments were resolved or not resolved, and either outcome was bearable, because neither of them was, any longer, pretending. One evening in late autumn, perhaps 2 years after the morning of the locks, he came in from the stables with his hair damp from a sudden rain, and found her by the fire in the small library, reading a letter from her brother. She looked up. She did not rise. She said, simply, that her brother was coming for Christmas and would bring his new wife, whom she had not yet met. He sat down opposite her, in the chair that had become, by long use, his chair in that room, and he said that he would be glad to see them. She nodded. She returned to her letter. After a moment, without looking up, she reached across the small table between them and rested her hand briefly on the back of his. She did not hold it. She did not need to. She withdrew it after a breath and turned the page and went on reading. He sat very still. He understood that this was what he had been given in place of the other thing. He understood that it was enough. He understood also that he had not earned it exactly, and that he would go on not exactly earning it for the rest of his life, and that the going on was the point. Outside, the rain quieted. A log shifted in the grate. Somewhere upstairs, a child's voice called for her mother, and her mother answered, and the voice was satisfied and did not call again. The house that had once moved around her without his noticing, moved around them both now, and he heard it, and was grateful, and did not say so, because there are certain gratitudes that are spoiled by being spoken. And there, by that fire, with the rain easing on the windows, and a letter half read on a small table, and a hand briefly laid and briefly lifted, we will leave them. Not because their story ends there, for of course it does not, but because the part of it that mattered to us has done what stories of this kind do, which is to bring two people who had been living past one another into a room in which they could, at last, see one another, and to let them sit there together a little while. If you have ever come home in the early hours of a morning you cannot quite account for, and found a door that would not open, and understood, standing on a step in a cold that was not entirely the weather, that the life on the other side of that door had gone on without you in ways you had not troubled to imagine, then you know something of what the Duke knew when the key would not turn. And if you have ever been the one inside that house who had at last put down the pen and rung for the locksmith, and slept very little, and dressed carefully, and waited at a breakfast table in the first light, for a person you had loved and been failed by, then you know something of what the Duchess knew when she said, without raising her voice, "Sit down, Aurelian." I would like to know, if you would tell me, which moment stayed with you tonight. Was it the lock that would not turn? Or the ring set down beside the saucer? Or the small posy of hyacinths in a room that had been made ready without comment? Or the hand that rested for a breath on the back of his and was withdrawn? Sit with it a moment. It is yours now, as much as it is mine. And if you found a kind of warmth in sitting by this fire with me tonight, then come back. There will be another fire, and another story, and another quiet door opening at the end of a long day, and a chair kept for you. Pull it close. Put your feet up. The kettle is on. The next tale is already gathering itself in the dark beyond the windows, waiting for us both. Until then, my friend, sleep gently, and be kinder than you were yesterday to whoever shares your roof. Good night.